Now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. A half-century ago, the world was witness to the Cuban Spring, an indigenous and popular uprising against a corrupt and brutal dictator. The Cuban people, unassisted by foreign military forces, cast off the shackles of rapacious exploitation and chose for themselves a new and uniquely adapted path of progress, global citizenship, and development that was not measured by the levels of corporate or individual excess, but on the fulfillment of the needs of its citizens, particularly the poor. Alas, some states did not greet this Cuban Spring in the same sentiment and spirit of enthusiasm with which they welcomed, assisted, or instigated other subsequent revolutionary movements. For the past 5 decades, Cuba has been the subject of an economic, commercial, and financial embargo whose scale and scope have no parallel in the modern world. For the past 20 years, the international community has spoken in an increasingly unified voice against the continued imposition of this blockade. Today, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines unreservedly aligns itself with the positions expressed by the Non-Aligned Movement, the Group of 77 and China, and the Caribbean community in again calling for an end to this unjust, immoral, and illegal embargo. Mr. President, by almost any measure, the embargo is an unmitigated failure. It has served only to visit suffering on the Cuban people and as a jingoistic backdrop to a smattering of pandering politicians who value their individual electoral fortunes above integrity, international law, and the weight of overwhelming global condemnation. Today we must ask ourselves, what place does this embargo have in our modern world? And in an interconnected world of open borders, free movement of people, goods, and capital, how can the champions and architects of globalization simultaneously legislate the isolation of one state or place extraterritorial restrictions on commerce, global trade, and the movement of individuals? How can the electorate of one district, or one constituency, or one country determine the cargo and path of a ship sailing into and out of Cuban waters, or the manner in which banks and corporations of other countries conduct their business with Cuba? As a developing country, heavily dependent on remittances and affected by an international economic meltdown not of our own making, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines finds it inexplicably cruel that any state would seek to limit the amount of money that one family member could bring home to another, or the value of items in a gift parcel, particularly in the midst of this global recession. Mr. President, today, there are countries in which the United States soldiers are heroically fighting and shedding blood in wars. Yet US citizens may travel to these countries, and foreign banks may transact business in these countries. There are countries whose system of governance or whose practices and values are diametrically opposed to the American way of life. Yet the bonds of trade and the mutual respect for sovereignty supersede these differences, and no embargo exists to impose the ideals of one nation upon another. Only the Cuban embargo remains as the last surviving relic of a Cold War that otherwise exists only in history books and museums. Even if every vicious lie, every unfounded allegation, every spurious and demonstrably false characterization of the Cuban government were accepted as fact, they would not justify the existence of this embargo in a modern world of interconnection and multilateral engagement. Mr. President, no country in this hall has the right to tell the United States how to conduct its foreign policy, who its friends should be, or how to determine its national interests. Even if such a right existed, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines would not presume to exercise it against our cherished friend and neighbor to the north. But every country in this hall is obligated by the United Nations Charter to oppose instances where national foreign policy decisions morph into violations of international law, or into sustained disregard of the Charter principles of sovereign equality and non-interference in the domestic affairs of states. Among the complex and interlocking system of laws that perpetuate the Cuban embargo is the United States Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act of 1996, which conditions the easing or lifting of the embargo upon a determination that a transition government or a new government is in power in Cuba. I am unaware of any other instance where the principle of regime change is so nakedly codified into the legislation of another country. The Helms-Burton Act has a stated policy objective of installing a, quote, democratically elected government, unquote, in Cuba, and helpfully supplies a congressional definition of what constitutes a democratically elected government. According to the provided definition, as it appears in Section 206 of the Act, a democratically elected government is one which, and I quote, has made demonstrable progress in returning to United States citizens and entities which are 50% owned by U.S. citizens property taken by the Cuban government from such citizens on or after January 1st, 1959, or providing full compensation for such property. This is the definition of the democratically elected government. Whatever the merits of this definition of democracy, the continued application of the Act stands in marked contrast to the words uttered by our esteemed friend and brother, the President Barack Obama of the United States, in his inaugural address to the general debate of the UN General Assembly. In that address, President Obama rightfully stated that, and I quote him, "Democracy cannot be imposed on any nation from the outside. Each society must search for its own path, and no path is perfect. Each country will pursue a path rooted in the culture of its people and its past traditions. And I admit that America has too often been selective in its promotion of democracy," unquote. We in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines heartily endorse and support these words, but words without works are meaningless. The President of the United States has considerable discretion to ease the crippling restrictions imposed on the Cuban people, and we respectfully urge him to consider the full extent of his powers in light of his indisputable commitment to multilateralism, respect for international law, and his well-documented efforts to alleviate the suffering of peoples worldwide. Mr. President, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines is aware that our small country and small population and small economy, not to mention the waning military significance of the Caribbean region, have allowed our needs and concerns to be overlooked by those who see the world only through the prism of their narrow and immediate interests. However, Cuba has remained a staunch and abiding partner in the development of our country, even in times of global hardship. Cuban universities have graduated over 250 Vincentian students and are currently playing host to 150 more, free of charge. Her surgeons have performed operations on over 3,000 Vincentian patients without charging them a penny. Her doctors have brought quality medical care and expertise to the most remote areas of our country. Even as we speak, Cuban engineers, architects, and workers are laboring alongside Vincentians in the construction of a modern hospital and our very first international airport. As far wealthier nations and institutions have looked askance at our developmental struggles and offered only dubious prescriptions, platitudes, and trite cliches, the Cuban people have rolled up their sleeves and given freely of themselves in a manner that has touched the hearts of the Vincentian people. No dollar amount can adequately reflect the value of this support, solidarity, and partnership, for which the Cuban people have asked nothing in return. Our appreciation cannot be overstated. Allow me, Mr. President, in closing, to return to the stirring words of President Obama's inaugural UN address. And I quote, "The world must stand together to demonstrate that international law is not an empty promise. No one nation can or should try to dominate another nation. No world order that elevates one nation or group of people over another will succeed. The traditional division between nations of the South and North make no sense in an interconnected world, nor do the alignments of nations rooted in the cleavages of a long-gone Cold War. The time has come to realize that the old habits and arguments are irrelevant to the challenges faced by our people," unquote. These words, Mr. President, embody a promise of change in which we can wholeheartedly believe. Recent events have reminded us that change, like peace, is oftentimes hard. But not all aspects of change are hard. Some simply require a modicum of political courage and a willingness to hear not the hackneyed sloganeering of an increasingly narrow and local political interest, but instead heed the insistent, consistent, and overwhelming voice of the international community, friend and foe alike, and indeed one's own sense of conscience, compassion, and common sense. I thank you very much.
I thank